A basketball and assumptions. The neighborhood was unusually quiet that sunny afternoon, save for the rhythmic thud of a basketball bouncing on the pavement. Ethan Carter, a lively 12-year-old with a love for basketball, was outside perfecting his dribble and jump shots. Having recently moved into the area with his mother, he was eager to feel at home, though he hadn't yet made friends. His bright smile and polite demeanor hinted at a young boy full of potential. Ethan's basketball rolled out of his driveway, bouncing across the street and into the yard of Karen Thompson, a middle-aged woman known for her meticulous lawn and watchful eyes. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years, and her reputation as someone who was quick to judge preceded her. Ethan followed the ball, stopping at the edge of her property. "Hello. Excuse me, my ball's here," he called politely, his voice light with the innocence of youth. When no one responded, he hesitated but decided to step onto the yard to retrieve it. To him, it was a simple act, a natural solution to a small problem. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Karen was watching from her window. Her gaze locked onto the boy, her mind racing with assumptions. Who is he? Why is he here? She didn't see a child retrieving his basketball. She saw a stranger, someone who didn't belong. Without pausing to think further, Karen picked up her phone and dialed. "Hello, police. There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "He looks suspicious. Can you send someone right away?" Sirens and accusations. By the time Ethan picked up his ball and started back toward his driveway, the sound of approaching sirens made him stop in his tracks. A patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their faces serious. Ethan froze, clutching his basketball tighter, unsure of what was happening. "What are you doing here, son?" one officer asked, his tone calm but firm. Ethan's voice trembled as he replied, I just came to get my ball." It rolled into her yard. Before he could explain further, Karen emerged from her house, pointing at Ethan with a sharp, accusing finger. "That's him. He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says, that boy doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Ethan's chest tightened. He looked at the officers, then at Karen, then back at the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. "I wasn't trespassing," he said softly. "I was just getting my ball." Karen's voice rose, dripping with disdain. "Oh, sure. That's what they always say. It starts with a ball. And before you know it, they're scoping out houses to steal something." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled, his eyes stung, but he held back tears. The officers exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed but pressured by Karen's insistent claims. "Can I call my mom?" Ethan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The governor arrives." Ethan's mother, Lisa Carter, was not just any parent. She was Governor Lisa Carter, a trailblazer and the state's most influential leader. In her office, the phone rang, and when she heard Ethan's trembling voice recount the situation, her heart sank, then ignited with determination. Lisa made 2 quick calls. Within minutes, a convoy of black SUVs roared toward the neighborhood, sirens blaring. The sight of the approaching fleet caused a ripple of confusion and unease among the onlookers, including Karen, who stood frozen, her earlier confidence faltering. The SUVs came to a halt, and Lisa stepped out, her presence commanding immediate respect. She moved with purpose, her face a mask of calm authority. The crowd parted as she walked toward her son, who stood near the patrol car, clutching his basketball like a lifeline. "What's happening here?" Lisa asked, her voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge. One of the officers cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Governor Carter, we were called here for a report of suspicious activity. This young man was seen on private property." Lisa's gaze shifted to Karen. "And you made this report?" Karen nodded, her voice quieter now. "I saw him in my yard. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, so I called the police. I thought it was the right thing to do." Lisa let the silence hang for a moment, her piercing eyes never leaving Karen. Then she spoke, her tone calm but cutting. "This is Ethan Carter, my son. What evidence do you have to suggest he was doing anything suspicious?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, struggling to respond. Lisa turned to Ethan, her gaze softening. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, but his hands still shook. Lisa straightened and faced Karen again. "So let me understand this," she said. "A 12-year-old boy retrieves a basketball from your yard, and your first instinct is to call the police." Karen's face reddened, but she pressed on. "I didn't know who he was. He could have been anyone. And kids like him." She stopped herself, realizing too late the implication of her words. Lisa's voice dropped, razor sharp. "Kids like him. What exactly does that mean?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Karen stammered, her earlier confidence crumbling. "I didn't mean. I just thought." Lisa stepped closer, her voice steady and unwavering. "You didn't think. You assumed. And your assumptions say far more about you than they do about my son." The weight of Lisa's words settled over the crowd. The neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet agreement. Karen looked down, her face flushed with shame. "Governor Carter, I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause all this." Lisa sighed, her expression softening slightly but retaining its firmness. "It's not me you need to apologize to," she said, gesturing toward Ethan. Karen hesitated, then turned to the boy. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have called the police." Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "It's okay," he said quietly, though the memory would linger. Lisa addressed the officers. "This ends now. My son deserves better than this." The officers nodded, quickly wrapping up the situation. The crowd began to disperse, the tension dissolving into a heavy silence. As the convoy prepared to leave, Lisa knelt in front of Ethan. "You did nothing wrong," she said, her voice filled with love and pride. "Remember that." Ethan nodded, a small smile breaking through his solemn expression. "Thanks, Mom." Lisa stood, taking his hand. Together, they walked toward the convoy, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed. It indicates justice should never depend on assumptions, and every child deserves to feel safe, no matter where they are. Sirens in the suburbs. Ethan stood frozen, clutching his basketball as the distant wail of sirens grew louder, piercing the tranquil afternoon. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why were the police here? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? The thought sent a chill through him. As the patrol car turned the corner, the flashing lights reflected off the windows of the neatly lined houses, casting an eerie glow. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, stepped onto their porches and peered out from behind curtains. Whispers rippled through the street like an unspoken current of tension. The police car came to a halt near Karen Thompson's yard. Ethan's heart pounded as two officers stepped out, their faces unreadable but serious. The taller officer approached first, his gaze scanning the scene. He was calm but authoritative, his hand resting lightly on the belt that carried his radio and other tools of the job. "Son," he began, his tone measured, "we received a call about some suspicious activity. What are you doing here?" Ethan tightened his grip on the ball, his fingers digging into the leather. His voice came out small, barely audible. "I was just getting my basketball. It rolled into her yard." Before he could explain further, Karen stepped forward, her arms crossed and her expression firm. "That's him," she said, pointing at Ethan. "He's been lurking around here all day. I saw him snooping near my windows." The officer glanced between Karen and Ethan, his brows furrowed. "Is that true?" he asked Ethan. Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling. "No, sir. I wasn't snooping. I was just..." Karen cut him off. "Oh, please. That's what they all say. It starts with a ball. And next thing you know, they're casing the neighborhood, looking for something to steal. Ethan's mouth fell open, the weight of her accusation hitting him like a punch in the stomach. Around him, the murmurs of the growing crowd seemed to grow louder, their eyes fixed on him as though waiting for him to prove or disprove her words. The shorter officer spoke up, his tone less accusatory but still firm. "Do you live around here?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "I just moved in with my mom. We live 2 houses down." Karen scoffed, her arms tightening across her chest. "That's convenient," she muttered under her breath. "Kids like him always have a story." The words stung. Ethan looked down at his feet, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. He wanted to explain, to tell them how he had simply chased his ball, but his throat felt tight, and his mind was a blur of confusion and fear. "What's your name, son?" the taller officer asked, his tone softening slightly. "Ethan," he replied, barely above a whisper. Karen's voice rose again, sharp and insistent. "Well, Ethan, maybe you should learn to stay in your own yard. This isn't the kind of neighborhood where you can just wander wherever you like." The tension in the air thickened. Ethan's hands trembled as he held his basketball close, his mind racing for the right words to defend himself, to make them see that he was just a boy, not a threat. The officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "All right, Mom," he said to Karen. "We'll take it from here." He turned back to Ethan. "We need to clear this up. Why don't you come with us for a moment?" Ethan's heart sank. His worst fears were coming true. He looked at the officer, then at the crowd, and finally at Karen, whose smug expression told him she believed she'd won. "Can I call my mom?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. The officer nodded. "Of course." Karen frowned, her earlier confidence faltering slightly. "What's that going to do?" she muttered. Ethan pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. As the line connected, he heard his mother's voice, steady and strong. "Hi, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Ethan's voice cracked as he explained the situation. "Mom, the police are here. They think I did something wrong." I didn't." Lisa Carter's voice sharpened, a steel edge cutting through her usual warmth. "Stay calm, Ethan. I'll handle this. I'm on my way." Ethan nodded, his heart still racing, but bolstered by the certainty in his mother's voice. He hung up and looked at the officers. "She's coming." Karen raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched on her face. Oh, great. What's she going to do? What Karen didn't realize, what no one in the crowd realized, was that Ethan's mother wasn't just any parent. Governor Lisa Carter wasn't the kind of woman to let injustice slide, especially not when it came to her son. Minutes later, a new sound filled the air, louder and more commanding than the sirens before. A convoy of black SUVs sped down the street, their lights flashing in synchronized rhythm. The powerful engines roared, their presence impossible to ignore. The crowd turned, their murmurs growing into audible gasps. Karen's face twisted in confusion as she stared at the spectacle unfolding before her. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Ethan stood still, his gaze fixed on the convoy as it pulled up. The SUVs came to a stop, and the doors swung open in unison. Out stepped Lisa Carter, poised and commanding, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. Every movement she made was deliberate, her presence radiating authority. Karen's jaw dropped as recognition dawned. This wasn't just a mother arriving to defend her child. This was the governor of the state. Lisa's heels clicked against the pavement as she approached, her expression calm but unyielding. The crowd parted instinctively, giving her a clear path to her son. She stopped in front of Ethan, her eyes softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, though the relief was evident in his eyes. Lisa straightened and turned to the officers, her voice firm. "What's going on here?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. "Governor Carter," one began, "we received a report of suspicious activity. This young man—" Lisa cut him off with a raised hand. "This young man is my son, and I want to know why he was treated as a suspect for retrieving his basketball." Her words echoed in the stunned silence, a clear challenge that no one could ignore. The neighborhood, once quiet and judgmental, now held its collective breath as the truth of the situation began to unfold. A mother's justice. Lisa Carter stood in the middle of the quiet suburban street, her poised figure a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Her tailored suit and unyielding expression conveyed more authority than any flashing lights or badges could. The crowd that had gathered watched with a mixture of awe and unease. This wasn't the arrival they had expected, not from a boy's mother, and certainly not from the governor of the state. Karen Thompson, who just moments ago had been brimming with misplaced confidence, now seemed to shrink under Lisa's gaze. She clutched her arms across her chest, as if to shield herself from the judgment she knew was coming. Lisa turned to the officers, her voice calm but layered with a force that commanded respect. "Let's go over this again," she said, her eyes locking onto them with precision. "You were called here because a boy retrieved his basketball from a yard. Correct?" One officer hesitated, glancing nervously at his partner before nodding. "Yes, Governor. That's correct." "And did this boy, my son, do anything else to suggest criminal intent? Did he damage property, act aggressively, or was he simply trying to retrieve what was his?" The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. "No, ma'am," one replied. "He didn't cause any harm." Lisa nodded, letting the silence hang heavy. Her eyes shifted to Karen, who flinched under the scrutiny. "You," Lisa said, her tone sharper now, "made the call. I want to understand your reasoning." Karen sputtered, her earlier smugness dissolving into a weak defensiveness. "I didn't know who he was," she said, her voice trembling. "He was in my yard. How was I supposed to know he wasn't up to something?" Lisa raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable, but her silence devastating. "You saw a 12-year-old boy," she said finally, her voice deliberate, "and instead of asking him why he was there, instead of showing even a modicum of humanity, you assumed the worst. Why?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The neighbors watched, the weight of Lisa's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Lisa stepped closer, her voice dropping to a tone that cut through the tension like a blade. "Let me make this clear. My son is not a threat. He is a child, and he deserves to feel safe in his own neighborhood. You robbed him of that today." Karen's face flushed deep red, her eyes darting toward the crowd as if searching for an ally. She found none. Lisa turned back to the officers. "I expect a full report on this incident, including the details of how it was handled," she said firmly. "And I expect an apology to my son." The taller officer nodded, his posture stiff. "Of course, Governor. We'll follow up immediately." Lisa's focus shifted to Ethan. She knelt down, placing her hands on his shoulders, her expression softening for the first time since she'd arrived. "Ethan, look at me," she said gently. Ethan raised his eyes, tears brimming but not falling. "Yes, Mom. You did nothing wrong," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "You are not defined by anyone's assumptions about you. You are strong, and you are brave. Don't let this moment make you doubt that." Ethan nodded, his grip on his basketball relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. Lisa stood, turning to address the entire crowd now. Her voice carried with it the weight of both her position and her purpose. "This isn't just about Ethan. It's about the world we're creating for all our children. We cannot allow fear, ignorance, or prejudice to dictate our actions. We must do better. For them." The neighbors, who had been silent observers, began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded, others looked away, their own biases laid bare by the confrontation. Karen, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke, her voice a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes downcast. "I shouldn't have assumed." Lisa regarded her for a long moment before responding. It's not me you owe an apology to. Karen turned to Ethan, her expression one of shame and regret. I'm sorry, Ethan, she said. I was wrong. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. It's okay, he said quietly, though the pain in his eyes suggested the memory would linger. Lisa took Ethan's hand, her protective grip a silent promise. As they walked toward the convoy, the crowd parted to let them through. The neighborhood seemed quieter now, subdued by the gravity of what had just occurred. As Lisa helped Ethan into the SUV, she paused to look back at the street where it all happened. She knew this moment was bigger than her family, bigger than the injustice her son had faced. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. The door closed, and the convoy began to pull away. Inside the car, Ethan leaned against his mother, his basketball resting in his lap. Thanks, Mom, he said softly. Lisa kissed the top of his head. Always, sweetheart, always. And as they drove away, the lesson they left behind lingered in the air. Every child deserves to feel safe, and every assumption has the power to harm or heal. It's up to us to choose which legacy we leave behind. A neighborhood transformed. As the convoy disappeared down the street, the neighborhood fell into an uneasy silence. The crowd slowly dispersed, the weight of what had transpired still hanging in the air. Some went inside, eager to escape the tension, while others lingered, whispering amongst themselves. Karen Thompson remained rooted in place, staring at the spot where Lisa Carter had stood. Her mind churned with a mixture of shame, confusion, and realization. The confident, decisive woman who had made the call to the police was gone. In her place was someone who was beginning to question not just her actions, but the assumptions that had driven them. The next day, Ethan was back outside in his driveway, dribbling his basketball. His movements were slower, his usual exuberance dimmed. Though his mother had reassured him, the previous day's events lingered in his mind. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him, even when no one was around. But he wasn't alone for long. Mrs. Martinez from down the street walked over, her young son in tow. She smiled warmly at Ethan. Hi, Ethan, she said gently. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. It wasn't right. Ethan managed a small smile. Thanks, Mrs. Martinez. Her son, a boy about Ethan's age, shuffled his feet awkwardly. Then, summoning his courage, he spoke up. Hey, do you want to shoot hoops? I'm not very good, but I could use some practice. Ethan's smile widened. Sure, he said. I'll show you a few tricks. As the two boys played, a few more neighbors stopped by. Mr. Lin from across the street brought over a portable water cooler. It's a warm day, he said with a chuckle, setting it down by the driveway. You kids might need this. Ethan's driveway began to fill with laughter and conversation. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the same space just a day earlier. Watching from her window, Karen couldn't help but notice the transformation. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as a stranger but as a child, just a boy enjoying a game of basketball. She sighed deeply, the weight of her actions pressing on her chest. Finally, she made a decision. Gathering her courage, she walked out of her house and approached the group. Her presence silenced the chatter, and all eyes turned to her. Ethan stopped dribbling and looked at her, his expression cautious. Karen cleared her throat, her voice trembling. Ethan, she began, I owe you a proper apology. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. I let my fear and ignorance get the better of me. Ethan stared at her for a moment, then glanced at his mother, who had just walked outside to join the growing group. Lisa gave him a small nod, her eyes encouraging. I forgive you, Ethan said finally, his voice steady. But I hope next time, you'll ask questions before assuming. Karen's face softened, and she nodded. I will, she promised, and I'll do better. The exchange seemed to lift a weight from everyone present. The neighbors, inspired by the moment, began to talk openly about their own biases and fears. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was a start. Over the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. Ethan's driveway became a gathering place for kids and parents alike. Karen, who had once been quick to judge, became one of the most active participants, organizing neighborhood events and encouraging dialogue. Lisa Carter, true to her word, followed up with the local police department. She worked with them to implement new community engagement policies and implicit bias training. The incident with Ethan became a case study, used to educate officers and communities across the state about the dangers of unchecked assumptions and the importance of understanding. Ethan, for his part, became a symbol of resilience and hope. His story spread beyond the neighborhood, inspiring conversations about equity and justice. At school, he gave a presentation about his experience, emphasizing the importance of standing up for yourself while extending forgiveness to those who wrong you. Karen attended that presentation, sitting in the front row. When Ethan finished, the applause was thunderous. Karen stood, tears in her eyes, and joined in. The neighborhood was no longer defined by suspicion or fear. It became a community, a true community, where people looked out for one another and saw each other for who they were, not who they assumed them to be. And as Ethan continued to shoot hoops in his driveway, he knew that while the scars of that day would always be a part of him, they had also led to something greater: change, connection, and the unwavering belief that even in the face of injustice, a brighter future is always possible. A ripple of change. Months passed, but the memory of that fateful day lingered in the hearts of everyone in the neighborhood. What had begun as a moment of injustice had sparked an unexpected transformation, not just for the community but for the state at large. Ethan, once a shy newcomer hesitant to venture beyond his own driveway, had become a catalyst for change. At school, Ethan's story resonated deeply with his classmates and teachers. The principal, moved by what had happened, organized a school-wide assembly focused on understanding diversity and combating stereotypes. Ethan was invited to speak, but at first, he hesitated. "Mom, I'm not sure I want to talk about it again," he admitted one evening, his basketball resting forgotten at his feet. "What if it just makes things worse?" Lisa knelt beside him, her voice steady but full of warmth. "Ethan, sometimes sharing our stories helps others see what they might not understand. You have a chance to teach people, to make them think differently. You've already started to change our neighborhood. Imagine what you can do for your school." Ethan considered her words and, with a deep breath, agreed. The day of the assembly arrived, and the auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and even some parents filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the small stage where Ethan stood. At first, his hands trembled, but as he spoke, his voice grew stronger. "I never thought chasing a basketball could lead to what happened," Ethan began, his words deliberate. "I was scared, confused, and angry. But my mom taught me something important. We can use moments like that to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." He went on to share how the incident had opened his eyes to the power of understanding and the harm of assumptions. He didn't point fingers or dwell on blame. Instead, he focused on the lessons learned and the ways people could do better. By the time he finished, the audience was on its feet, applauding. Some clapped, others wiped away tears, but all of them left the auditorium with a sense of purpose. The governor's initiative. Lisa Carter, inspired by her son's courage, decided to take the lessons from her family's experience to a broader audience. She launched an initiative called See the Person, aimed at fostering understanding and empathy in communities across the state. The program included workshops, community events, and partnerships with schools and law enforcement agencies. At one of the initiative's town hall meetings, Lisa stood before a crowd of hundreds, her voice carrying the same conviction that had moved her to action months ago. "Prejudice isn't just an act. It's a mindset," she said. "And mindsets can be changed. But change doesn't happen by accident. It requires effort, dialogue, and the courage to confront our own biases." Karen Thompson, who had become one of the program's most vocal supporters, stood up during the Q&A session. "Governor Carter," she began, her voice steady, "I just want to thank you and Ethan for giving me the chance to change. I'm ashamed of how I acted, but I've learned so much since that day. I hope to spend the rest of my life making up for it." The room erupted in applause. Lisa smiled warmly. "Thank you, Karen," she said. "It's never too late to grow, and your willingness to reflect and change is exactly what this initiative is about. A growing legacy." As Ethan grew older, the events of that day became a defining moment in his life, not as a source of trauma, but as a reminder of the strength and resilience within him. He channeled his experiences into action, starting a youth program focused on building bridges between communities. The program, called Neighbors United, brought kids from diverse backgrounds together to play sports, share stories, and learn about one another. Ethan's driveway, once the scene of misunderstanding and fear, became the program's unofficial headquarters, a place where laughter and teamwork replaced judgment and suspicion. National media caught wind of Ethan's story and the positive changes it inspired. He was invited to speak at conferences, appear on talk shows, and even meet the president. Each time, he spoke not about himself, but about the importance of understanding others and standing up for what's right. "I'm not a hero," Ethan would say. "I'm just a kid who wanted to play basketball. But if my story can help other kids feel safe and valued, then I'll keep telling it." The neighborhood today. Back in the neighborhood, the transformation was undeniable. Families who had once kept to themselves now gathered regularly for block parties and community events. Karen became a beloved figure, known for her tireless efforts to promote inclusivity and understanding. She often told people, "I made a mistake, but it taught me how important it is to listen and learn. If I can change, anyone can." Ethan's friendship with the neighborhood kids blossomed, and his driveway basketball games became legendary. Every game was a reminder of how far they'd all come, a symbol of hope, unity, and the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding could create ripples of change. The final play. Years later, Ethan stood in that same driveway, now an older teenager. A new family had just moved into the neighborhood, and their young daughter watched from across the street as he dribbled his ball. Ethan smiled and called out, "Hey, want to play?" The little girl hesitated, then nodded shyly and ran over. As they played, the neighborhood watched with warm smiles, a living testament to the change that had started with one boy, one ball, and one moment of courage. Because sometimes the greatest changes begin in the simplest ways, with a ball, a voice, and a willingness to believe that a better world is possible. The power of a ripple. Ethan's story, the neighborhood's transformation, and the statewide changes sparked by Lisa Carter's initiative became enduring symbols of what happens when courage meets opportunity. From one moment of misunderstanding and fear came countless moments of growth, empathy, and connection. The driveway where it all began stood as more than just a place for basketball. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when the world seems unfair or unjust, every one of us has the power to create change. Years later, at a dedication ceremony for a local community center inspired by the Neighbors United program, Ethan, now a young adult, stood at the podium. His voice, confident and steady, carried the weight of his journey and the lessons he had learned. "We all make mistakes," Ethan said, looking out at the crowd that included neighbors, police officers, teachers, and families of every background. "What matters is what we do after those mistakes, how we choose to grow, how we choose to listen, and how we choose to act." He paused, letting the words sink in. That day in the neighborhood wasn't the best day of my life, but it taught me something important. We're all part of the same community. We have the power to make each other feel welcome or unwelcome, valued or ignored. And that power comes with responsibility. The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan wasn't done. He smiled and held up his old, worn basketball, the same one that had rolled into Karen Thompson's yard years ago. "This ball was just a toy to me then," he said. "But now, it's a symbol of what we can overcome together. It's a reminder that the simplest actions, like retrieving a ball, can start conversations that change the world. As he stepped down from the podium, the crowd rose to their feet, cheering not just for Ethan, but for the community they had all built together. Lisa Carter, standing proudly beside her son, wiped away a tear. Karen Thompson, sitting in the front row, clapped the loudest, her face alight with gratitude and pride. The ceremony ended with a basketball game on the new court at the community center. Children of all backgrounds laughed and played together, their joy echoing through the air. Ethan joined in, dribbling and shooting with the same enthusiasm he had as a 12-year-old boy. The lesson was clear. Every action, no matter how small, has the potential to create ripples of change. The key is to approach the world with kindness, understanding, and the courage to stand up for what is right. In doing so, we not only transform ourselves, but also the communities we are part of, leaving behind a legacy of hope and unity. And so, Ethan's story wasn't just about a boy and a basketball. It was about the power of compassion, the strength in community, and the belief that even in the face of adversity, a brighter, better future is always within reach. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.